We have now gone live and we are ready to begin. Good evening and a warm welcome to the webinar on the safety of journalists. My name is Junaina and I will be the host for this evening. Before we begin the webinar, I would like to invite the Secretary General of Maldives Media Council, Dr. Ibrahim Samir, to say a few words.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope that you can hear my voice clearly, right?
We can.
First of all, let me just welcome to all the distinguished participants for this important webinar. And it's my great pleasure to welcome for this webinar on the safety of the journalist. And as you know that today we are living an unprecedented era in which the journalist and media professions confront significant concern ranging from the safety of journalists to the freedom of expressions. And also due to the COVID pandemic, all these things has put a lot of challenges for the media workers as well as for the journalists and the media houses in order to execute their job well. Due to that reason, we want to identify the different kind of challenges that the journalists as well as the media houses that are facing due to this COVID pandemic. Through this webinar, we want to identify those things and tell all the journalists as well as the media houses regarding that. And MMC has always been committed in safeguarding the journalist safety, encouraging the press freedoms and facilitating free access to information. And before concluding, I want to express my gratitude to the moderators as well as the distinguished presenters, specifically the panelists for their times and contribution for these webinars, as well as for the UNDP, and also my secretariat colleague for organizing this event. And also, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to all participants for their participations, and wish all the best for this webinar. And we do appreciate the times and the considerations that you put for this webinar. And let me just hand over the floor to the analyst who will be serving as the session moderator from now.
Thank you, Dr. Samir, and thank you, Janina, for the introduction. Tonight, we have a global group of panelists, experts in their field who've worked across the world, both in the protection of journalists, but also as journalists themselves, which I think gives them a very, very strong understanding of the needs of journalists and the challenges faced by journalists. So tonight we have with us from Washington, DC, we have Mr. Stephen Butler, Dr. Stephen Butler, who's the Asia Program Coordinator for the Committee to Protect Journalists. He's also a former journalist and has worked extensively across Asia for organizations like the Financial Times. We have Rai Munava, who is a journalist based in Malé. For those of you in the Maldives, Rai will be very well known to you. She was the editor of The Edition until very recently, an English language newspaper that covered politics and travel and features and really the whole gamut of stories that the Maldives throws your way. We have Tamara Braylow, who also comes to us from Washington, DC. Tamara has worked for CNN, she's worked for BBC and Al Jazeera. She has been the head of high-risk deployments at Al Jazeera during many difficult times, including the Arab Spring and Syrian uprisings. And she is currently a journalism lecturer, and she has worked quite extensively in Bangladesh, which I think will be very interesting to talk to her about. She's had a focus in her work in Bangladesh, working with investigative journalists. We have Joel Whitaker. Joel is the head of high risk at ITN, which is one of the biggest broadcasters in the UK. So he looks after multiple channel high risk deployments for ITN. And he's also worked extensively in the field as well, particularly for CNN, I believe, but we also work together at Al Jazeera. So Rai, being our resident journalist sitting in the Maldives, I'd like to start off with you, because tonight we do want to talk about the Maldives, but we want to sort of inform the Maldivian experience with regional experience as well, to talk a little bit about what's gone on in Afghanistan and Pakistan and India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. But right, if you can give us some bit of a background briefing, really, on what it's like to be a journalist in the Maldives. What kind of challenges do you face?
Well, just to start off in terms of the Maldives, for a population for just about 500,000, we have over 50 outlets, probably even more if you factor in print and broadcast specifically. But anyway, the point is that it makes for quite a congested market. And outside of that, at least in terms of our constitution, we're seen as very homogeneous people, the choice of which has, of course, impacted our freedom of speech and expression in the country. However, more than such apparent challenges, I would say, is the issue of a safe environment for journalism across the nation. Although the climate for it is certainly improved, as is, evidenced by the climb that we've seen on the Press Freedom Index, for example, from quite a jump from 120 to 72, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Anyway, there's still quite a sort of need for investigative journalism in the country, although they have been good efforts, of course. And the government itself has noted, I think, the fact that, there is a lack of investigative journalism and so forth. However, in my opinion, the present administration at least seems to call for increased efforts on part of Maldivian journalists, that is to do their part to uphold the democratic cause of the country as its fourth estate, simply banking sort of on the good faith that it's earned by repealing the draconian defamation law. Because as it stands, local reporters still work under quite a heavy shadow of impunity cast by offenders who have been accused of murder, enforced disappearances, and sexual harassment, where justice has either been refused or is still remains pending. So the environment that creates itself is quite challenging. It's difficult to expect, or there's sorry. So despite it being an electoral pledge that had promised to sort of really empower our journalists, what we see is, in my time as a former managing editor, I think there's somewhat of an audacity in asking us to risk the lives of our newsrooms when there's little to indicate that security has much improved. The government itself, past and present, has acknowledged deep-rooted extremism in the country, and numerous other factors. There's been evidence to indicate abuses of power in the government, present and past, and even throughout the pandemic, we've seen instances of corruption and that sort of thing. And what we continue to observe today, unfortunately, is I think that the country is yet to meet its promises where journalists and journalism is concerned. Even today, we're waiting on an outcome on the evidence bill, which is in discussion at the Parliament. Article 136 of which seeks to allow judges to sort of require journalists to reveal their sources under two circumstances, which is, in my opinion, too many, because there's quite a lot of room for abuse and there's a history of it as well. Anyway, further, we've seen not even continued, but increased attacks on journalists, digital attacks and harassment online, for which, to my knowledge, there's no redress mechanisms. And even there's been issues with undue force by police authorities during opposition protests, I think, which has been highlighted by the Media Council itself as well. Anyway, none of this is in line with the reforms that we are being assured of. And, while this is happening in the aftermath of the pandemic and lockdowns, most of our journalists are still struggling with the economic repercussions. They have less job security, And, this is coupled with the general feeling of threat as well. So I think there's been a lot of opportunity for political factions to exert their influence. There's been increased situations of corporate dependence. Of course, this is not a situation that's unique to the Maldives, but as the case is with most developing countries, it is somewhat exacerbated in our circumstances. So despite being passionate about the pursuit of truth and so forth, I think the safety of journalists in Maldives is an area that we need to prioritize first. It's paramount, I think, that urgent changes are made to ensure that small independent medias continue to exist and to grow, and moreover, to allow for Maldivian journalists to do their work freely and, without fear.
Thank you, Rai. I mean, having spoken to so many journalists in the Maldives over the past 18 months or so, there's no doubt that things have improved, but you are working against a background of 30 years of attacks, disappearances, murders, et cetera, and it carries a heavy burden. And I just want to go back to something you said about the legislative framework that in the Maldives at the moment, because I think that has quite a lot of parallels to what Tamara was working on in Bangladesh and what Steve was working on in countries like Pakistan. So, I mean, the law can be a great friend, but also a great enemy to journalists, depending on how it's used. So, Tamara, do you want to tell us about some of the work that you did in Bangladesh and some of the issues with perhaps some misuse of the legislative system against journalists in Bangladesh?
Yes, Bangladesh had a similar situation. I've been working there since 2017. In 2017, their main problem was the so-called Section 57, which was a broad and vague set of instructions that nominally meant to advocate responsibility on a part of journalists, but instead promoted insecurity due to their vagueness, because they were so broad that you could be indicted for any kind of reporting that the government wouldn't necessarily agree with. They managed to replace it, and fortunately they replaced it with the Digital Act, which slightly shifted focus to include the digital media, which wasn't included in the beginning, and just renamed the set of rules for instead of protecting journalists, the emphasis seems to be put on protecting the public from the journalists, and I think that's been a you can see that worldwide, whether it's an old democracy or a new democracy, developing country or a fully developed one. We can. Rai addressed so many issues, but I would like to allow someone else to address the law, the legal aspect of it first before.
Sure. Steve, what about your work in countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan that we were talking about? We were talking briefly when we had our conversation the other night about what can be done to improve things. And, we did speak about legislation, but legislation can also be misused. So what's your experience of perhaps looking at legislation as a solution to protect journalists, but also legislation where it can be misused and misinterpreted and actually harm journalists?
Well, I think the Tamara's reference to the Digital Security Act in Bangladesh is really kind of a model, unfortunately, that other countries are adopting in one way or another. I mean, in Pakistan, the government is now proposing to bring in a new regulatory system in which there will be a single regulator governing broadcast newspapers online, The government would have essentially, summary authority to force content to be removed, and if it's not removed, the people who are responsible for putting it up could be put in prison. And this is without even going through a court system. There is an appeals process outlined in the new rules, but it would have to go straight to the Supreme Court, which is not a very realistic way of dealing, with these issues. In India, you have increasing use of anti-terror laws and defamation laws to put journalists into pretrial detention, which means that they can languish in prison, for years. I mean, literally years. We have cases in Kashmir. There's a case in Uttar Pradesh that we're following, very closely. There isn't a very clear avenue for justice. And we object to the arrest of these people, period. But they're sort of languishing in the judicial system. And you have something similar, in Sri Lanka, where people can be picked up and held for 6 months, and then that can be renewed. So it's clearly a regional trend. I mean, what I would say, and Tamara referred to this very briefly, is what we are seeing worldwide is a retreat from the kind of press freedoms that were taken for granted, I think, in earlier years. You have the United States speaking with a voice that's much less authoritative than it was in the past. So countries, this was particularly true under Trump, but also true under President Biden, that countries fear less what the United States might do if they, cross the line and put journalists in jail. And then at the same time, you have China growing as a force, which is really showing the way of how you can control the online digital life. Now, the countries throughout South Asia are not exactly following the Chinese model, but they are picking up technologies. They are establishing rules. For example, trying to force social media companies to host content online and breaking the security of these digital communication methods. So I think very broadly, you were seeing this sort of pattern repeated, and the forces working in favor of more freedom of the press are somewhat weaker than they have been.
Okay, I want to just move on to the logistics of how you work with journalists in the field. And Rai, we were talking about this the other day when you were explaining to me that you had, when you were managing editor of the edition, really, quite a young group of journalists working for you, trained in-house generally, very well at the edition, I'd like to say. But you had real fears for them, not just in terms of the usual sending them to a protest and they may get harmed, but even sort of reporting on anything that may have to do with politics or corruption or even general news reporting on politics. Can you tell me what you did in terms of a risk assessment before you sent one of your young journalists, of which the majority were women, out to cover a story?
Well, obviously, there's always some sort of risk with journalistic work, particularly field work. But, it was one of those things where I didn't hesitate to send women to protests and such, but also B, I didn't have a lot of choice. But I think what was more difficult was convincing journalists to sort of navigate or, say what they really think is, to tell the real story, that they know there's a story there and they want to make sort of persuasive points or, points that could be viewed as controversial, particularly when they were covering, for example, something that has to do with extremism or, Syrian refugees who returned to the Maldives, that sort of thing. it's very difficult for me, even as editor, to convince them to, report on such issues. There's always like, can I please remove my name? And, there's a real sense of like, I really don't want to put myself out there, and I don't want to, I don't want to be noted for someone who covers these issues. I don't want to be known for someone who makes analytical reports on these kinds of things, as much as they want to say what they have to say, and as much as there is a story sort of to get them to, sorry.
So what were the repercussions they were concerned about? What did they fear would happen to them if they became known to cover certain stories, or if they had their name on certain reports, whether it be anything to do with extremism or anything to do with corruption? What were their fears?
Well, I mean, with extremism, I think it was just a real fear of living in the capital city, or wherever, and just interacting with people. I mean, we live in quite close proximity to each other, so the idea that, and if someone could tell you, or someone could just come inside your residence or find out where you live, it's all too easy to do. I mean, and the incidences that have happened in the past, just stand as evidence to how easy it is to get. One of the journalists who was in my newsroom actually did have an attack for voicing out sort of mild, how do I put it? So his stance was, I think, about tolerance but it was viewed as standing against the religion. But that, I personally know him, and I know that was not his intent. Anyway, he wasn't attacked during my time as editor, but it was very difficult for me. I think in the probably 7 or 8 months where he worked for me, not a single article, I think, carried his name. Yeah, so I mean, the fear runs deep, and he was attacked. He was hospitalized about 5-6 years ago. So I mean, it still stands with him. And of course, that's the case with everyone. And working in a newsroom where the experienced journalists carry these burdens even more heavily, it has an impact on those who are receiving training as well. Even though, for example, they may not have experienced the same sort of thing. So in terms of, to get back to what you originally asked, with risk assessment, it's very difficult. I mean, obviously we know what topics are very sensitive at the given time, depending on the political climate of that moment. And sort of, so that's, I don't know if we do a proper assessment so much as we just sort of hope for the best and say a little prayer. Yeah.
I mean, the other impact is it has a lot of self-censorship that comes with it, and even a lack of entry into the profession in the first place, doesn't it? But Joel, look, I'd like to bring you in now, because what I want to talk about with you is, because you work so closely with both these sides. You deal with the physical safety of people in the field, but you also have to take into account all of the political context and the legal context when you both deploy people into the field, but when you also are working with local staff in the field. But what you have, which I think is really interesting for the Maldives Media Council, which is a regulator here who's hosting this webinar, is you also have to deal with the regulator in the UK that has very, very strict rules about how things should be done. So could you talk us through some of the decisions you make when you're either sending people into countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan more recently, where there are multiple threats. There are threats, physical safety threats. There are threats of imprisonment. There are such sensitivities. They're working with local staff. How do you go about? It's a very big question, but how do you go about starting to assess what is safe and what is not safe?
Yeah, I think it is a changing environment. I think just this last couple of weeks, and obviously I work for a British broadcaster, few channels, few TV channels. And your traditional threat, going back to Ray's point about filling out a risk assessment now is difficult. Your traditional threats that we've faced for years, certainly the last sort of 30 years where we've actually got the risk assessment process in place, can be reasonably easy to navigate. And so if we're going into a war zone, we have the helmets, the vests, we have the right contacts on the ground. We do our due diligence with the people that are going to help us on the ground when we go into the field. and things like that. And it's reasonably black and white, not always, and it depends on the conflict zone. It depends on the environment and how dynamic that environment is, and the various players in that environment, from terrorists to state. What I would say is, and listening to the conversation so far, and certainly just for me, even the last few weeks, how insanely busy it has been with the domestic threat. And I'm talking about the UK, right? Where actually you think, well, the domestic threat, how harsh, how bad is that? But there are clear parallels between the UK and many other parts of the world. And it is exposure, because our journalists, when they go to a well-known conflict zone or an area that we know is going to be really dangerous, then we have all the right equipment for them. We do a risk assessment process that's very thorough, and they've got the right training, and that they're the right fit for that story, and their experience, and. But our exposure isn't there. Our exposure is with our domestic staff going out on the ground day after day. It's not even a demonstration, or it's a small demonstration. It's certainly not a riot, but the characters at that demonstration, and perhaps the state involvement too, pose a real threat to our journalists. And it is in, and listening to the voices from the contributors so far, it is in that almost freedom of speech. I am quite nervous about freedom of speech for the media. I'm not media, I'm not a journalist, I'm a safety person, but I'm nervous about freedom of speech for the media, generally, globally. And it's a big issue. And I think, we have to be brave, but we also have to mitigate. And just to sort of get to your point, how we would mitigate on things like online abuse, or being somebody knocking on our door and, visiting us at home, or finding out where we live, or where we drink, where we work, and catching us and beating us and things like that, is we've really got to think very carefully about our own personal security. And I ran a check for a couple of channels just last week, a general open source check on what information I could get on key personalities who are on the TV who could potentially be targeted by certain groups, fringe groups, things like that. And it's quite disturbing the amount of information I was able to get from things like, in the UK, we have Companies House, I'm sure you'll have similar, personal addresses that were really easy to get hold of. 192, which is our telephone directory in the UK, it was easy to get addresses. And if you pay a little bit of money, you can get way more information and more accurate and more timely. But even an open source search can really quite quickly find out where you live as a journalist. So not only will you suffer online abuse potentially, but your address could be put out in doxing and things like that. So back to the point of, we really have to go sort of back to basics. And before we even send anybody out or get them to publish anything, have a look at what their risk profile is. Are they likely to be targeted? Yes, most journalists are these days. And in that case, then where are the vulnerabilities? Is it their home address? Is it their children's school? Like, what are the vulnerabilities for this person? And we've got to work on this together. And editors can't do it alone. Neither can security function. We all have to work on it together. So look at what those vulnerabilities are, and then just logically mitigate them, just like we mitigated the war zones with the bombs and bullets 20 years ago. And we sort of got a point of leverage there, where we've sort of fixed it a lot, where most journalists can operate in quite dangerous areas quite safely. I know, I send people there all the time. We've got to do the same thing now for our freedom of speech, so that we can actually go out there and tell the story, gather the story, impartially, but with a not in fear.
I have noticed that, I haven't thought about it as succinctly as you just put it, but I have noticed definitely an uptick in issues of journalists being harassed in the UK. And it's certainly familiar territory for people like Rai in the Maldives, where I think there's quite a lot of, because it's such a small country and it's such a social media culture as well. Look, I want to move on to investigative reporting, because I think everybody has quite a lot of knowledge on this aspect. And it is something in the Maldives that is brought up time and time again, the fact that journalists should be doing more investigative reporting. There are many barriers to this. I'll get Rai to sort of run us through a few. Then Joel, I want to come back to you again, because I know, you and I have worked on investigative reporting access, really. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how that happens, because it's quite a long process to perform investigative reporting. And I don't think really there's a big recognition amongst non-journalist, non-media people about that. But Rai, could you just give us very quickly a couple of minutes on sort of what the challenges are for investigative reporting in the Maldives?
Sorry. Just from the get-go, it's been quite difficult in the past. Of course, I've not been able to see how things have improved in the last couple of months. I've been kind of off the radar, but and then, you know, as you know, of course, changes have been made quite recently, but in the past, it's been really difficult to get information. It seems to me like every meeting with editors or whatever that I've attended, it's just a repetition of RTI is so tough, RTI is so tough. So that's certainly been a problem. It's obviously not designed for the purpose of journalists, and more so for, you know, public needs, and that's of course an issue. There's always been a very difficulty in obtaining information, particularly from government sources. So that's one very, and then the other thing I think that's most difficult is, I mean, not everybody is sort of trained also, particularly with fact finding and verifying information. So that's a challenge in some newsrooms, I'm sure. Just not having enough people to cover daily, while, you know, of course, investigative efforts require a lot more time and dedication, and you know, running a full daily news cycle with about a team of 3 people, you know, it's challenging as well. And outside of that, I think it's just, you know, what we've sort of repeated, just a repetition of what we've already discussed. That's the fact that it doesn't feel safe. There are lots of threats. It's difficult to obtain information, but when you do get to that point, there's a lot of other dangers that you have to then deal with. So, yeah, of course, that's a prevalent issue.
Thanks, Rai. So, Joel, I mean, in the recent past, in the last 6 or 8 months, we've done some secret filming requests, we've done some right to replies, we've done, oh gosh, what else? Everything that an investigative journalism TV report requires. Can you talk us through a little bit about what goes on in the background in a large news organization that has strong regulatory oversight, about how and why there are such safeguards on investigative reporting and things like secret filming and undercover reporting?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And actually it is, you mentioned earlier about Ofcom, which is obviously our big regulator, you know, with big teeth, right? And they can bill us a lot of cash or charge a lot of cash if we stuff up, and really challenge us. So it is top of our sort of risk assessment process is that we conduct any investigation, you know, within the confines of the law. And obviously it's there for a reason, right? I'm not here to sort of defend the law and all that sort of stuff right now, but it's there for a reason, people's rights, etc. So as we know, so it is important that we adhere to that. So what I would say to you is, as a pretty large organization, you know, obviously happily, I don't work alone on these things. We've got a legal department, and the legal department sits next to me on the front end of any investigations. And, you know, so we are going through this whole process of, okay, who's your source? You know, what's their angle? We need to know everything we can down to the macro, you know, of what this story, where it came from, and, you know, what vulnerabilities are there to us as a media organization. And we find that out from getting as much information as possible. You know, it's always about gathering as much, you know, timely and relevant and accurate information as we can possibly gather, writing it down, noting it down, keeping a record as we go, because often on the back end of an investigation, you know, the police are involved, of course. Often we send information to the police. They want to know, why didn't you let us know about this sooner? Because let's say we're investigating a terrorist organization, you know, you're going to have a set amount of time where you can look at this potential story to assess whether it's real or not. And you want to get it depends. It's not like fixed, but it's pretty tight. And if you go over that amount of time, you go to jail, right? It's serious. Terrorism Act in the UK is serious. So we have to be really careful that we are quite quick when we see a source with an information, or we hear a source got some information and we think it's very serious, like terrorism, you know, we're quite quick on the legal side of it. So I'll work together with the legal side of it. Back to your point.
Yeah, great. I mean, of course, everything also has to be in the public good, doesn't it? It first has to be proved to be we can't just go digging around people's information. We need to show that it's in the public good. So it has this kind of, it coincides with the ethical framework of journalism. And of course, at the end of the day, you don't want to get sued. So that's the other thing that you also want to avoid. So Tamara, if I could move over to you, because you've worked a lot with investigative journalists in Bangladesh, where, you know, the UK is let's just say it's a long process to do investigative work, but it is a very robust process because of the regulatory oversight. What happens in Bangladesh?
One of the most devastating things that I have noticed is that, like the Maldives, Bangladesh market is congested. It is there is corporate dependence. There are struggles with issues of self-censorship and censorship, but job security is starting to influence thinking about safety in the worst possible way. During one of the seminars, I had a conversation with a journalist who got beaten up when he approached the subject of his investigation. And so obviously the question was, did you suspect that it might happen? Did you plan for it? And he said, yes, I expected it. Again, for me, the obvious question was, why do it if you're expecting to be beaten up? To which he responded that this is just how it works. And, you know, throughout the seminar, it became obvious that most journalists attending it were beaten up at least once, if not several times, in a process of doing their investigative report. And there's a view that almost this gives credence to the story. It's not just that we don't think about safety going in, but the incidents, even incidents of physical violence, are almost expected for the story to be credible, which initially they were heading in the right direction, you know, trying to set up measures that could maybe make it easier for them to operate. But over the past year or so, there's a sense of them having given up on safety measures altogether.
Steve, how do we, as media development practitioners, how do we create an enabling environment for investigative journalism? And perhaps if you have any examples from a South Asian context, that would be really, really useful to hear.
Well, there are some successful examples. You know, Umar Chima in Pakistan basically single-handedly, he didn't force, but he single-handedly led to the opening up of the Pakistani tax system, because he did an investigative report showing that members of parliament weren't paying any taxes, and it caused outrage, and so they ended up reforming, you know, the entire system. You know, on the other hand, there's another journalist, a Pakistani journalist who is now in exile, who uncovered the wealth that was accumulated by, you know, a former head of the army or a senior military official while he was in office, something like $50 million. You know, he is attacked brutally. He can't go back to Pakistan. His family now is under threat. He's trying to get them out. So I think that, you know, it's a very difficult situation. If you're going after someone who is powerful, in many of these countries, there really isn't much of a successful way to protect yourself, and I think that's the brutal reality of it. And so it certainly does limit, you know, what journalists are willing to do. I mean, a number of the very successful investigative journalists who I now know have decided to turn their attention elsewhere. They're not going to write about corruption. They're going to write about environmental issues. Of course, that has its own set of dangers. But in other words, they're trying to turn their attention away from topics that get them into trouble, that are bound to get them into trouble. So now there is.
Ryan, sorry, continue, Steve.
No, I said there is journalist safety legislation that is coming. There, the state of Chhattisgarh in India has a journalist safety bill. Pakistan has put forth a journalist safety bill. They haven't enacted it. That is widely endorsed by the press community. So there is some movement in the other direction as well.
So I saw you nodding there because I know that you have become very involved in environmental journalism recently. Was it because you sensed that that was a space in which you could operate safely? Or was it because we haven't spoken about this before, but what made you choose to move into that space?
See, I knew I would get into trouble for smiling at that point. Yeah, obviously I relate to this. But what I've found is that trouble has kind of followed me whichever direction my writing has gone. So environmental journalism hasn't particularly given me any kind of safe hold. But yeah, to answer what you've asked is, no, that's not why I ventured into environmental journalism. I've actually got a long background in conservation work. Yeah, but I will say it seemed like a natural course of action. My departure from my previous position had a lot to do with safety concerns, I will say. But yeah, so it did seem like a natural and a safer way for me to move forward. But what I've sort of proven to myself is that my style of reporting, or kind of possibly because I don't shy away too much from what I intend to say, it has landed me in trouble regardless.
I think environmental journalism in the Maldives is be careful what you wish for. There's a lot of overlap with investigative journalism there. But if we could sort of focus on how do you find those safe spaces? As a journalist, and somebody who's often asked to teach in investigative journalism, of which I'm not an expert, I have done some. I'm always concerned about telling people or teaching people to do things that I don't feel are safe. And really the end point is, where do we find the stories where journalists can cover that are effective, important, in the public good, but safe for them to do that? Tamara, when you work with your journalist trainees in Bangladesh, is this something that you workshop a lot about, stories that you can possibly get an entry point into?
Yes. We also tend to concentrate on different techniques that you can employ to make it safer. I have one issue that Bangladesh has had since they started as a country is that the media is so polarized that you have actually two bodies for protection of journalists that are politically on separate ends of the spectrum. So the one thing that I always start with is to protect journalism as a profession, to try to bridge whatever differences there are, whichever side is getting hit at that particular moment. It generally doesn't take too long for the other side to feel the heat too. The second thing that we always deal with is there is no communication, there is no network amongst them. Everybody starts an investigation from the very beginning, sort of things that are out there already. there's no way to access them. So what we ended up coming up with is a network of investigative journalists, which is an informal way of sharing information about safety, anything from don't go down this road to this officials, bodyguards will beat you up. And lastly, I think cooperation is really, really important. It also sends a message that we're all in the same boat. And although we may have different views, that protecting the profession and everybody's right to express those views should take precedence over whatever daily issues or differences that we may have. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, and you make a point that I want to pick up, firstly with Joel and then going to Steve. This point about, we need to protect the profession of journalism. And I think this is something that's really being lost. And Joel, I'd like to ask you first, what kind of relationship does ITN have with Ofcom and, say, the police if something happens? Who is responsible for journalist safety? If you ascertain that there's a threat to one of the journalists, what happens? Does Ofcom get involved? Do you contact the police? I mean, who is responsible for journalist safety?
No, it's not Ofcom. From my desk, from the high risk desk, it certainly wouldn't go to Ofcom. It would go to the police, and we do that quite often. But the problem, of course, is the police are very busy, and they may not get the threat or have the resources to understand the threat fully. And a good example would be, we had one of our female, not unusual, correspondents, horribly trolled recently, on and on and on. Now, we record what the information is that she gets, and we forward it. We log it and we forward it to the police, and the police investigation goes on. And then we get another reporter and another reporter and another reporter. So we get not a backlog of cases, but a whole bunch of cases we're waiting to be dealt with. Cases that really, the reason we've taken it to the police in the first case is because it is harmful mentally, but also there are safety aspects. So I'm going to meet you outside your work. I know where you live. Those sort of direct threats, or implicit threats even, but they're dangerous. So it's a serious threat to journalism and freedom of speech. And we will speak to the police about it, but they don't necessarily get it. I would also say, going back to Tamara's point, actually, about that cooperation and knowledge share. In fact, sorry, I'll get to that in a minute, because it's so good, actually. But just back to the point of the police, it is not the police that are blowing open, Oxford Analytica and those sorts of stories. It is investigative journalism. It is so important that we don't shy away from this much needed profession, right? And I kind of feel we almost need to educate the public into how important it is what you do, because they read the headlines, they read the stories, and they find it fascinating and mostly impactful, and mostly it benefits society. But then on the same hand, they are lots and lots of the public are very happy to destroy the messenger, to take you out in many different ways. So I kind of feel we need to get the public back on side a bit. I realise this is not helped by heads of state at the moment, quite often in the UK and abroad. So I kind of feel that we need a debate around that. Back to the point of investigative journalism tactically, Tamara had a good point there about cooperation and knowledge share. And I think, wow, it's such a basic, actually, because when we go back to war zones, and bear with me, you don't just turn up in a war zone. You will ask people who've been there before, what was it like? Where are the safe places? Where are the good places? All that sort of stuff. It's a basic. And this is absolutely right for investigative journalism too. I've done investigations with ITV, actually. And, we need to know, how did it roll for the team that did it last time? Or in a similar circumstance. So that knowledge share we found was vastly important. Hope I answered your question.
Thanks. Steve, if I can move on to you, because I think we all agree, as we would from our backgrounds, that journalists need to be protected. But where does the buck stop? I mean, who should be responsible for protecting journalists? What's your experience? I mean, what have you seen? Good models? I mean, we all know that the police is the logical answer, but it's not often realistic.
Well, police, very often are part of the problem, and they are the problem because, particularly once you get out of, a lot of attacks on journalists don't necessarily happen in major cities. They happen in local areas where the police are very close to the local power structure. And if a journalist is investigating something involving a powerful businessman or politician, the police are going to be reluctant, to pursue that. There are exceptions. I mean, if you look into the investigation into the murder of Gauri Lankesh in India, we were there. We met with the lead investigator, and the family is actually, was reasonably happy about the way that the investigation was proceeding. That's a rarity. When journalists are killed or beaten up, almost always the police are part of the problem. There are exceptions, but that is generally the case, I think.
And Rai, from your experience, who protects journalists in the Maldives? Or what could be done to better protect them?
So much. I think all of the points. I just like to mention some of the points that I really related to. Joe's point about public trust, I think, was excellent. It's something that I've discussed as well a lot. That I think that there has to be a little bit of effort made to build that trust. I think that goes a long way in terms of combating like misinformation and disinformation as well. Just when the public knows who to trust and how to judge the news that they receive. I think that's very important. And also to get them on our side, because all too happy to shoot the messenger. That's always been the case here. And Tamara's point about cooperation, I think that's something that's sorely needed here. I think that would go a long way into just assuring. I don't know how easy it would be, as media and people and factions are polarized here heavily as well. But, even if it has to come to a point where, there are two entities working for the better, safety and security of journalists, whatever it is, I think, it should be put into motion. We need to make some efforts to cooperate and try and navigate the space that we are in. Definitely. As Stephen said, police have been part of the problem. That has been the case for as long as I can remember, at least from the beginning of my career. That's always been the case. And that's, it's like when we do receive all of these threats and harassment that we speak of, who do we call? Of course we call the police. We tell our editor calls the police, whatever it is, that's where it ends up. And every single one of these cases, whether that's Yamin or Rilwan or the names that I will not mention from my own newsroom, every single time we have informed the police on multiple occasions, and it was come what may at the end of the day. So yeah, absolutely, that has to be improved as well. I think police are very happy to destroy equipment and then justify that, or speak in the defense of press when they do press conferences, but in action our safety has never been their primary concern. That's not what I've seen. I'm sorry to say, but it's not what I've seen. I'm probably going to get into a lot of trouble for saying so, but yeah.
That's your opinion and your experience. Tamara, I can hear the call to prayer while Rai was speaking, so that means we have to wrap up soon. Do you have any final thoughts, just a minute or two, because we do need to wrap up now?
I did want to address one thing that it's a question of impunity, because I think that's one of the issues that can be addressed, that would advance how we approach this profession at the moment. We went from being protected profession to being a target, an enemy of the state in a lot of countries. And I think that even as the climate changes, the media impunity sends the message that for journalists, nothing's changed, right? Even if it becomes friendlier towards the media, unless we start investigating previous incidents of violence against the journalism, none of it is going to get sorted. That would be it from me.
Steve, very quickly, impunity. We did talk about this last night as well. Incredibly important. I know Rai will be nodding away and smiling there, but we don't have time to go back to you, Rai. But Steve, please just give us your thoughts on this issue.
Well, it's absolutely critical. In fact, tomorrow we are releasing our annual report on impunity, and look at it. It's a terrible situation when very few murders or attacks on journalists are ever adjudicated and to a point of justice. So it's an absolutely fundamental issue.
Thank you. Look, thank you, everybody. We do need to go because prayer time is upon us, or upon everyone in the Maldives at the moment. Janina, could you come back in, please, just to thank everybody and say good night. Thank you. But thank you from me.
Yeah. Thank you, Annalise. So we have now reached the end of the webinar, and we hope you have benefited from very useful discussions that we have had here today with all the panelists. Thank you to all the panelists for giving us your time here today, and for the participants as well for joining us. And I wish you all a very good night or a good rest of the day, depending on your time zone. Thank you again. See you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Junie. Thank you, everyone, for joining.